You are listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. I'm your host, Shannon. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I also happen to have a love for tarot. Each episode, I invite you to reflect with me as I work to demystify the tarot and the human experience, all while exploring tarot's connection to mental and emotional health. While this podcast may feel therapeutic, it is not meant to take the place of psychotherapy. So grab your cards and join me as I work to create a pathway to better understand ourselves and those around us. Today we're getting a little tender, a little curious, and if I'm being honest, maybe a little uncomfortable, because we're diving into something I think a lot of us carry silently. This deeply ingrained habit of over-explaining, oversharing, and having a constant urge to seek closure or clarity, even long after a moment has passed, or maybe even long after it's relevant. If you've ever found yourself sending a follow-up text message that begins with something like, just to clarify, or if your stomach starts hurting until every possible misunderstanding is cleaned up, resolved, or put to rest, you're not alone. And this episode is for you. Because I was recently reflecting on the Page of Swords, and I had posted about it on Instagram. And the reason I was thinking about the Page of Swords, because I wanted to focus on what type of experiences that this particular archetype might carry or represent, what wounds it might hold. And one particular experience came to mind. So I shared this on Instagram, and I was blown away by the response. So many of you resonated with this idea of the Page of Swords kind of being a trauma response and an over-explainer. So yeah, we're going to unpack it a little bit more today and really get into the psychology of over-explaining and talk about the Page of Swords and also really just the court cards of the swords in general. So let's start at the root of all of this. So if you grew up in a household where conflict was avoided, where maybe no one kind of circled back to apologize, or where misunderstandings were kind of just, put under the rug and really just, left to rot until eventually it just became one with the rug, then chances are you developed some pretty strategic coping mechanisms in order to manage the emotional discomfort that comes with all of that. You might have also experienced gaslighting from a parent, a caregiver, teacher, or someone else in authority, which I'm going to explore as well as it relates to the Page of Swords. If you're not familiar with gaslighting, I know it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but at its core, gaslighting is a form of emotional manipulation. And when you are gaslit, it's when someone basically denies your reality, and it causes us to doubt our own perception of reality. And it doesn't have to be very overt. It can actually be subtle and can look like someone denying something that was actually said or done, or minimizing your emotional response or experience, shifting blame onto you, or trying to create some level of confusion or self-doubt. And when gaslighting happens repeatedly, especially during childhood, it ends up altering the way we relate to the truth, our perception, our reality. And what happens is we begin to try and seek higher levels of certainty outside of ourselves, because our own kind of like inner knowing, our own intuition, our own reality has been distorted. And we end up learning that our own perception might not be trustworthy. So what's the outcome of this? What's the consequence? Well, you might have ended up becoming someone who's like an over-explainer or a peacekeeper, So you learned basically you need to read the room. When you step into a space, you need to scan folks for any sort of subtle shifts in tone or body language, because you learned that if you could anticipate these emotional shifts, then you could potentially protect yourself from any sort of fallout from them. You likely also learned that relationships were incredibly fragile and maybe even unpredictable. You may have learned that communication was inherently unclear, and that if you didn't work really hard to make sense of everything, then things could fall apart, or you could get in trouble, you'd be blamed in some way, or something bad might happen. So this is where the Page of Swords comes in. So, like all the pages, this archetype is curious, yes, but the Page of Swords specifically is an observer. They're the student of truth, they're the thinker, but in the context of gaslighting or unresolved conflict, this archetype actually takes on a whole other complex layer. So at its core, the Page of Swords is young. They're just really beginning to learn how to speak up for themselves, how to ask questions, and also how to understand. They can also be hypervigilant because they're curious, and hypervigilant also due to potential trauma response. And this is where we can look at that raised sword in a different way. So there's, of course, so many different ways that we could read every card in the deck. So the way I'm talking about the Page of Swords specifically today isn't, of course, the only way to look at the Page of Swords. It's just one lens through, a psychological lens, a trauma-informed lens. So if the page becomes hypervigilant, that raised sword isn't one of a spark of a new idea or a symbol of curiosity. It then becomes a symbol of protection. So in this context, the page then becomes that over-explainer, the one who can't really rest. It's the one whose nervous system is constantly activated and will remain activated until the story, the narrative is told in its entirety, and the message is completely received, and any misunderstandings are avoided, and everything is clear and accurate. Because if things aren't clear, then their safety is threatened. And that's when we really start to notice that internal tension building. And the page kind of quietly ends up transforming into the Nine of Swords, especially as it grows into adulthood. If either hasn't been some sort of intervention or tending to before it kind of gets out of hand. And when it transfers to the Nine of Swords, that's when we see ourselves up all night, kind of replaying conversations, scripting future conversations, replaying different interactions, coming up with new interactions. And all of this is really consumed by those what ifs. What if this happens? Well, then I'll do this. And what if this happens? Well, then I'll say this. It's this process of really having to come up with responses in order to accurately depict the self, because they've experienced a history of either their own reality being gaslit, or having to kind of constantly worry if something has been resolved, if this archetype or person was raised in a situation where there was conflict and then, was swept under the rug and then never talked about again. Let's talk about gaslighting a little bit more. So when the Page of Swords is shaped by gaslighting, there's this younger inner part of us that exists. So we could think of this as, inner child work too. So that part of us kind of always is hanging out, if that was your experience. And it might come up to the surface or present itself in the forefront if we are kind of second guessing everything that we think or feel or see. It might be taking center stage if we believe that we need to gather more information in order to feel safe, or if we find ourselves trying to anticipate potential misunderstandings before they happen, or if we're feeling compelled to repeat ourselves or end up in this kind of like repetitive pattern of explaining what we mean by something. Or if we find ourselves kind of seeking for little bits of truth because, and others externally, because maybe we learned that we weren't able to trust our own perception. So this might look like seeking reassurance in other people saying, hey, you saw that, right? Hey, you heard that, right? Or can I get you to text that to me that you saw this too? So it's kind of like collecting, those external truths. So we can look at this page then, especially their sword, as both a tool and a shield in this case, because in a gaslit environment, the messaging we create and start to internalize really starts to sound like, okay, well, if I can explain myself perfectly, if I can remember exactly what happened, exactly what was said, if I can ask the absolute correct or right questions, then I can't be wrong. And if I'm not wrong, then I can't be blamed. And that means I can't be in trouble. And that means I'll be safe and I'll feel safe and everything will be okay. The problem is that level of survival strategy, a coping mechanism, becomes so emotionally and eventually physically exhausting. And it's deeply lonely and isolating. So again, this might show up by, especially in adulthood, we're sending long texts, trying to explain our feelings and our experience from every possible angle. I've seen this a lot, especially with clients who are in new relationships with a new partner where maybe there hasn't been any sort of trauma and they come to see me because one partner is just so overwhelmed at how much the other partner is explaining. And so we have to work on kind of creating safety and unlearning. Hey, you don't have to send that 10 paragraph long text message about why you're in a bad mood today. So if that's something that you notice, then this might be something that pertains to you. Again, repeating yourself in conversations. Or another one is feeling panicked when someone maybe gives a short response or is kind of vague, because then you go into that hypervigilant mode of, oh, well, what if I'm misunderstanding them? Or what does it mean if they're being short? I need as much information as possible to stay safe. And again, going back to that 9 of Swords experience of, kind of staying awake, staying up all night, even over the smallest disagreement, kind of wondering, what you did wrong, or even feeling responsible for resolving tension that might not even belong to you, especially if you were kind of the peacekeeper growing up and you saw your parents or caregivers, arguing or fighting. And then you had to kind of come in and play referee and say, hey, like, let's not do that. That's that inner child Page of Swords wound as well. And it's important to remember that these behaviors aren't irrational. They're residue. They're trauma responses. It's from growing up in a space where repair and reconciliation either didn't happen or weren't valued. And when that level of resolution wasn't modeled, then we're not left with any sort of example on how to carry that with us into adulthood. So the Page of Swords doesn't just want to be understood. They need it because they're trying to heal that core inner child wound that happened in their childhood. Because in their world, being understood, being clear equals safety. Another way this can show up, especially when we're looking at this through a trauma response lens with the archetype of the Page of Swords, is you could also become someone who maybe preemptively tries to manage chaos or uncertainty or conflict. So you might be someone who explains a lot to avoid potential or perceived rejection, or to avoid conflict, or to people please. You could also overshare in the hopes of being seen accurately. That's a big one. So if you were someone who experienced gaslighting as a child growing up, maybe your parents, caregivers, teachers, other people in authority denied your real experiences. Now you might be someone who really does whatever they can to express themselves in very particular ways because they are so desperate to be seen accurately. I understand this on a very deeply personal level. Gaslighting was very prominent in my household growing up. I mean, I remember being a child and, going up to a parent and saying, "Oh, hey, yesterday when you said, XYZ," and this parent just looking me dead in the face and saying, "I never said that." And me just being like, yes, you did. And then as a child, you're taught to respect your elders, don't question them. I very much kind of like my parents grew up in that children are to be seen, not heard era. So there was a lot of that residual holdover in my childhood growing up. So to try to combat or reject their statements would have resulted in something not great, and it would not have been a safe situation. So I very much know what it's like to feel the need to overshare or overexplode. Maybe not overshare because I don't share too much. Even just me sharing this on the podcast right now, I'm in my head going, "Oh, maybe I should edit this and cut this out." It's more of like over-explaining. I do that clinically. I often, when I'm talking to people or I'm on other podcasts, I am in my head saying, "Hold on, like you don't need to talk about this so much. Like people will get it." But I'm constantly kind of experiencing a low level anxiety of, am I going to be understood or am I going to be misperceived? So yeah, if you've experienced that, I get it. It's not fun. But it's definitely something that can be tended to and repaired. But, the outcome is often, like I mentioned earlier, exhaustion. And, another kind of way I've been trying to look at this too, especially when I'm working with clients, because of course it's so much easier when we're seeing this happen to somebody else and we have kind of a clear picture of what's going on, but we're almost preemptively performing peace. I like a good alliteration. Preemptively performing peace, or just performing peace by trying to overshare or over-explain. And it really kind of takes us out of the actual moment of connecting with someone or something because we're not truly experiencing what's happening. We're trying to essentially resolve conflict and control the situation, even if there's no conflict to resolve and no need to try and control what's happening. So how can we work with this archetype instead of feeling ruled by it or controlled by it? And the first part is really all about safety, creating a sense of inner safety before we're, so we can kind of like pause and stop trying to kind of the preemptive, trying to preemptively get outer clarity. So you could ask yourself something like, in the moment, once you start to recognize this, because you might not even be aware that it's happening. That's why I love like podcasts and reading, because then, and connecting with people on these types of topics, because the more that we talk about them and the more we learn about them, then we become more aware of how they're showing up in our everyday life. So now that you've listened to this podcast and listened to me kind of like ramble about this topic and this experience, if you start to notice it in yourself, that's when you can pause and be curious, engage the curiosity part of the pages and ask yourself, what part of me is fearful right now? And what does that part need? Because often it's not adult you who needs to keep explaining. It's that inner child you, the one who's still waiting for that closure that never came when you were 8 years old, or the younger you who's who was gaslit and whose perception of reality was constantly called into question. So you can also practice communicating with boundaries. I love the swords as representations of boundaries too. So to relate the Page of Swords here with boundaries, I feel like is also really relevant. And because the page embodies that younger energy, and because we're talking about it through this lens of conflict, or lack of conflict, reconciliation and repair, and also gaslighting, the page wants to say everything. But healing and tending sometimes means learning to say just enough and trying to figure out what that just enough is. And that's usually through experimentation, baby steps. Something that I tend to do often, and actually the podcast has helped a lot, and being on other people's podcasts, I will challenge myself because I'll start to notice, I'll be like, ooh, I am tending towards like over explaining right now. And the moment I feel like I've reached that point where I notice that maybe I'm over explaining, I wrap it up and I stop. And I allow myself to just sit with the discomfort of, oh my God, did I say everything that I needed to say? Are they going to understand what I mean? Because eventually that discomfort starts to fade. And it also gives whoever is in this situation or conversation or experience with you, it gives them an opportunity to ask questions and engage with you. So a way that you can practice the swords boundaries component here is maybe try to pay attention to when you are sharing or explaining yourself. And then once you notice, ooh, maybe I've said everything I need to say, just stop. And then you can trust, okay, I can be understood without overworking. And then you can also ask the other person, is there anything else that you need to know? Is there anything else that I can explain further? Allow the other person an opportunity to say, oh, okay, what I'm hearing from you is, and then if they're missing something or you still don't feel fully understood, that's when you can continue, sharing what you feel like needs to be shared. And of course, you can implement tarot in this process to explore maybe some past moments where you're still feeling the discomfort of lack of resolution. And you could pull a quick 3-card spread on this. You could ask, okay, you could think about the moment that maybe still bothers you or sits with you. And you could grab your cards, lay them face up, and go through the deck and try to find a card that represents that moment for you. That would be your anchor. So you're going to set that aside. And then you could intentionally pull, which means you could keep all your cards face up still, or you could shuffle and intuitively pull. So you might want to ask, what was it that I needed in this moment that I didn't get? What type of clarity? What type of reconciliation? What would that have looked like? What would that have felt like to receive that? And then you could ask or pull another card related to that part of you, and what part of that inner you, or what part of that experience is still very much present in your life today. Like basically, how does it show up for you in different interactions and different relationships? And then the third pull would be something about what you can offer yourself now. So it'd be kind of like the solution card if we're thinking in terms of simplicity here. So yeah, like what could you offer yourself now in terms of comfort and tending and even reconciliation? And as we wrap up this discussion on the Page of Swords and how it relates to being gaslit and lack of reconciliation with conflict, I also want to bring in the other courts, because I think that we could look at the whole courts series of the swords also as a trajectory for healing. We go from the page to the knight, to the queen, to the king, and that journey might look different for everybody. But if the Page of Swords represents kind of the beginning of this communication and healing journey, that inner child or that maybe tender voice that is desperate to still be heard, then the rest of the Swords court shows us how we can grow and move forward. So let's start with the knights. So the knights typically represent action of the court. So the Knight of Swords would be the one who is speaking quickly, still kind of like defending fiercely and still trying to fix things. And the knight tends to believe that certainty is more comfortable than vulnerability. And so them and the page can be in cahoots together. And so if we look at the knight, we might want to ask questions like, okay, how can I slow down a little bit so I don't go from maybe timid, scared Page of Swords to impulsive, eager Knight of Swords, to where it maybe makes situations worse than they are. I think the important component here is, what can I do instead of fighting your way into being heard? I think another important component of the knight here is that the knight is a bit more resourced than the page, because the knight has now graduated on to having a full-on horse at their disposal. And we can look at that symbolism as having protective resources. So I think here the knight invites us to look at, okay, what do I have at my disposal that I have learned that already makes me feel safe outside of this need to over-explain and overshare? And then we move on to the queen. So once we get to this kind of portion of the Queen of Swords in this journey, we realize that the queen is precise and clear and just gets to the point. She doesn't over-explain because she trusts her truth, her experience, and her ability to be clear. She's gotten to this point of inner repair, and her words are boundaries and not calls or bids for to be seen. Like, there's a level of confidence that exists with her, and she also very much holds space for still recognizing that the knight and the page exist within her. And then we move on to the King of Swords. And the King of Swords is finally at this point where they definitely don't need to be fully understood to feel at peace. The queen very much still desires being understood. She's just not at the point of the page where there's so much oversharing. Like, she's very, very clear and, like I said, precise and to the point. Whereas the king represents this like level of radical acceptance and kind of like, I feel like the king's kind of like my motto for the Queen of Swords is do no harm, but take no shit. And I feel like the motto for the King of Swords is, I can be misunderstood and everything's will still be okay. And I know that can sound kind of dismissive. And even as I'm saying it, as someone who has like deeply experienced this, I feel I feel like a visceral reaction to like saying this and being like, but I don't feel it. I don't believe it. That's not true. But the reality is, yes, I can be misunderstood and still be okay. I am not in any sort of physical danger. Someone could be listening to this episode right now and absolutely misunderstanding something that I'm saying, or maybe I even like explained something in the wrong way. and that's okay. I'm safe. And I am okay. And so I think getting to that point of the King of Swords is probably the goal. Although, again, none of these journeys are linear. We ebb and flow all the time. There are plenty of times where I feel like I'm still existing in that page world. And I'm just like, let me overshare this and let me overexplain this. Like even now, I'm looking at how long I've been babbling on this episode. And I'm like, oh my God, I try to keep these solo episodes short and I'm already at like 29 minutes. I should wrap this up. But yeah, so it's okay. Like nothing's 100% linear. We're going to ebb and flow. But the more time we can stay in that King of Swords space, the more regulated our nervous system is going to feel and the better we're going to feel. So as you spend time with the Page of Swords and just the courts in general, I just want you to remember you do not have to over-explain yourself to be worthy. You do not have to perform peace in order to earn closeness with other people. And sometimes healing is learning to sit in the discomfort of not being fully understood and seeing that you're going to be okay anyway. If you resonated with this episode, I'd love to hear your experience and your reflections. Please feel free to send me an email, send me a DM on Instagram. I really enjoy hearing from you all. And if you know someone who might resonate with this, sharing this episode would be amazing, especially if they're doing this type of work too. And it also helps other people learn about the podcast. And if you want to learn to explore these types of patterns and ideas and thought processes more deeply, I invite you to join us inside the symposium, where we honor both the swords and the silence. It truly is a place where we have built strong connections and we have a lot of fun just nerding out on these topics. So head over to thetarotdiagnosis.com and click the symposium tab to learn more. Thank you so much for listening to The Tarot Diagnosis. For more tarot and mental health content, follow The Tarot Diagnosis on Instagram. You can also subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and sign up to receive the Tarot Diagnosis emails, where you'll have access to exclusive spreads and exciting announcements. To join an incredible community of tarot and psychology enthusiasts, join the Tarot Diagnosis membership community, The Symposium, by visiting thetarotdiagnosis.com.